we go. A different picture of some of the same structures we saw in the last lesson. And I'm showing you two different pictures because sometimes the picture, the image will be from the front and sometimes it will be from the side. And things don't always look the same from both angles, so I just want you to be able to identify them. If I look at this picture, I'll start up here. You may or may not see the ureter. It's the duct that connects the bladder, which is the next line, to each of your kidneys. So there's a ureter on each side. The next line down is the vas deferens. And if you can see, it's pointing to, and I'll just highlight it here, this tube that's coming, or this duct that's coming from the bottom towards the top. The next thing on the list is Cowper's gland. Underneath that is the penis, and at the bottom, the testes. On the other side of the picture, there's one labeled here, but there's actually one on both sides. They're the little things that look like a leaf. Is the seminal vesicle. Now, the seminal vesicle produces something that will make up part of semen. Sperm will obviously make up part of it, but there's other stuff as well. These seminal vesicles produce mucus and fructose. Fructose, so sugar. Now, why do you think that semen would have to contain some sugar? What would be the point of that? Yeah? It's to give the sperm energy, because we saw the other day the sperm have a bunch of mitochondria, and they need something to use as their source of energy. The next one is the prostate gland. The prostate gland has a similar function to Cowper's gland. So these two things have a similar function. They produce mucus and an alkaline fluid. Now, why do you think that there needs to be a gland that would produce mucus or an alkaline fluid as part of semen? What would be the point of that? So to keep it safe while it's traveling to the egg. If you think about, and I'm just going to make a parallel here to your stomach. You learned about your stomach in Bio30. You have mucus and alkaline fluid in your stomach to help neutralize stomach acid, correct? Same exact reason that semen needs mucus and alkaline fluid. There are acidic environments that sperm has to pass through in the female reproductive tract before it finds the egg. If it doesn't have this layer of protection, they will die. The next thing on the list is the urethra, followed by the epididymis, and then lastly, the scrotum. Now, a lot of those we labeled on the previous picture, and then we talked about especially the structures associated with the testes and what they are for. One of the things that would be reasonable to ask you would be to ask you, what is the path that sperm follow from their site of production until they leave the male reproductive system? So we're just going to trace the path of sperm. Sperm start in the testes. It starts there because that is the site of spermatogenesis, and we saw that the other day. Then sperm go to the epididymis, and we saw the other day that was so that they could become mature. Then they go through the vas deferens, which is that duct that connects the epididymis to other structures. Now, as they go through the vas deferens, there are three things that contribute to semen besides the sperm that are there. So notice I'm not showing that the sperm are going into those three structures, but rather that they're contributing. That would be the seminal vesicle. That would be the prostate and Cowper's gland. So notice, sperm are not going in any of those glands. They're kind of like your pancreas in digestion, where it makes things that you need to digest your food, but your food never actually goes in your pancreas. Same sort of principle here. These glands are all producing something that will get mixed together with the sperm that are there to eventually form semen. So at this point, we call it semen. And if I can continue my pathway down here, it goes through the urethra, and then if ejaculation occurs, it will go on to the next portion of its journey. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about male reproductive structures, or perhaps the path that sperm follows as it moves through the male reproductive tract? Okay. Now we're going to consider the female reproductive system. I realize these words are kind of small, so I'm going to make some of them bigger by writing them out so that you can see them. I'll start on this side, and I'm just going to highlight what we're looking at. There's a structure here that I sort of circled in black. It kind of looks like if I put my hand like this, and I was wearing an oven glove, one of those silicone rubber things you can put on to put your hand in the oven. That's the shape. That's what we're looking at. That is here the uterus. I don't know why I made a lowercase e and the other one's capitals. That was weird. Now the uterus, if we think about what its function is, the uterus is the site of implantation. And the uterus really is where, if an embryo is going to develop, it's going to implant itself in the uterus and develop there. The next thing we have is the cervix, and the line for the cervix is pointing right there. So here, the cervix. And the cervix is the opening to the uterus. If something were to have to leave the uterus, it would have to go through the cervix. So if a baby were developing in the uterus, it would have to go through the cervix to be born. The next structure, and I'll just highlight it here, sort of this pathway leading towards the outer environment, that is the vagina. Now we said on the last slide, or I asked you, why does the sperm need mucus and alkali fluid? This is the main reason why. There is an acidic environment here. And it's there purposefully. It's to protect female reproductive structures from things in the external environment that could cause issues like bacteria. And since sperm come with their own protective coating, they should be able to make it through this environment without becoming destroyed. The last thing on this side is over here. This is the rectum, and it's part of the digestive system. So it's not part of the reproductive system, but because it is directly adjacent to all of these structures, it's often portrayed in the picture, just so you know what you're looking at. Now, if we look over here on this side, there are a couple of structures. There's a little round structure, and then there's this tube that leads from it. The tube is the fallopian tube. Now in this picture, we're looking at the reproductive system from the side. So we only see one of the two fallopian tubes. This is the pathway for the egg. The ovary is the little round structure that I circled here. So the ovary, this one, that is where oogenesis occurs. Now there's another line labeled there that says the fundus of the uterus. You don't have to know the different sections of the uterus in that sense, so you don't have to worry about labeling that one. This structure that looks sort of triangular in shape, that is the bladder, so part of the excretory system. And just notice the bladder is not connected to the reproductive system in a female like it is in a male. In a male, the urethra is connected to both the bladder and the reproductive structures, but not in a female. The next line here is just showing us a bone. Then we have the urethra right here, so I'm just going to highlight it. The urethra is connected to the bladder. Neither of those is a reproductive structure, but I like to point out where they're located. The reproductive structures are the ones in the middle. So the urethra and the bladder are on the front, the digestive organs are on the back, and the reproductive ones are the ones in the middle. The rest of the structures here are all external structures. There's the clitoris and the labia. None of those three would be things you would have to identify on a diagram because we're focusing on the internal reproductive structures. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about where something is on the diagram or maybe what something is pointing to? So what we're going to look at on the next slide is just the last picture that goes with all of these adult reproductive system things. We'll look at the female reproductive system from the front. And we'll look at basically all of the same structures, but if we were looking at a person from the front and we could see both sides, what might the picture look like? Okay, everybody's finished there. Now in this particular picture, all of the other structures have been omitted and we just see reproductive structures. If I were to add some of the other ones, for example, like the bladder would be right in front of it. That's why we don't see it on this picture because it would be covering up some of these structures. And the digestive structures would be behind the picture. You'll notice here a fallopian tube. There's one on this side, and there's one on that side. You'll notice that in one of the fallopian tubes over here, there is an egg. We will talk quite a bit about how and when the egg gets released. There is an ovary here, and then there's another one on this side. Now, there are a bunch of words that are all talking about the uterus. The uterus in general is this whole sort of triangular shape that's in the middle. And these three pieces over here are sections of the uterus. There's the uterine cavity, so the space inside of the uterus. There is the endometrium. Now, if you see endo at the beginning of a word, does anyone have an idea of what the sense of that piece of word means? Yeah? Yeah, endo, inside, like endothermic reactions are when energy goes in. So endometrium is the inner layer of the uterus. And the endometrium is very vascularized. Does anyone know what I'm talking about when I say that something is vascularized? How about listening about the word cardiovascular? What are we talking about in your cardiovascular system? Yeah? Yeah, so this is talking about blood vessels. So the inner layer of the uterus, the endometrium, is highly vascularized. There are lots of blood vessels there. The myometrium is another section of the uterus. Perhaps someone will remember what myo means as part of a word, like myoglobin or myogram or myosin. So muscles. So the myometrium is the muscular layer of the uterus. Now, what kind of muscles do you think there are in a person's uterus? You have some categories: cardiac, smooth, skeletal. What kind of muscle do you think that is? Probably, hey, because I don't know about you, but I can't control the contractions of my own uterus, and I don't want to. Contractions don't feel good. Because that's a muscle, it can cramp, just like any muscle can cramp. And the myometrium will be pretty important later on. If there were to be a baby in a woman's uterus and it needs to be born, these muscles need to contract to help push the baby along its pathway. Now there's the other two structures that we saw before, the cervix and the vagina, but we labeled those on the other picture. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about any of the structures that we labeled, whether it's the female reproductive system or whether it's the male reproductive system? Okay, I just want to make a comment. I showed you the path that the sperm follow, and I haven't showed you the path that the egg follows yet because that's coming up a bit later. So we will do that the same we did for the sperm, but just not quite yet.